viewers and listeners, and welcome to the latest episode of Extra Extra. It's all about whiskey. I remain your host of this particular corner of the interweb. I'm Jason Johnson Yellen, and he remains the co-host with the most, Joshua Morrissey Hatton. Hello.
Hello, Jason Neil Patrick Harris Johnston Yellen.
Has a beautiful ring to it, doesn't it?
It just rolls straight off the tongue.
So in Extra Extra, Joshua or I, or both of us together, bring a news article, often whiskey related, to the attention of the other, and we present it, and we riff on it, and we have a wee chitty-chatty, and we get out of here in a tight 35. I thought this week, Joshua, it was worth putting up the reminder about the tight 35, because as much as we consistently hit that number, I just wanted to make sure that our audience know that that is always on purpose and always done with the greatest diligence.
And with the accuracy. I mean, it is just precise every single time. You can set your watch to it.
It's Swiss, is how I refer to it.
There you go.
With more peaks and troughs than a Toblerone.
Well done, you.
All right, so we've had a few episodes here where we've gone from the unfortunate, the untimely passing of Paul McDonough at the Bon into the somewhat startling news, and yet not quite so startling when you burrowed into it, about Gordon and MacPhail kind of changing their business practice a little bit. We continue to duck and dive and dodge and bob and weave around celebrity endorsements. Charles Woodson just got into one with his whiskey and with the Oakland Raiders, now the Las Vegas Raiders, Joshua, before you correct me on that. And then another article on Rod Stewart. His Wolfie whiskey has now come to America.
All right. There you go.
But we don't talk about any of these things. So what we're going to do today is we're going to use a jumping off point as provided to us by the spirits business. Now, we purposely, by design, do not refer to sponsored content in Extra Extra. We only refer to the hardest hitting of whiskey news articles. It's a serious business over here. And so with sponsored content, it gave us a jumping off point to say, a very good point has been raised here. And I think it allows us to speak further about the Gordon MacPhail news. But as today's banner alludes to, it also allows us the opportunity to speak to the modern spirits business. And while we're doing all of this, I have a summer storm passing over the top of my office. And it's got it dark out the window. It is bucketing down on the roof. And I am having quite a wild time out here in the garden.
Wow, it's quite different here. It's sunny. There's no breeze. It's currently 81 degrees Fahrenheit. Do your own math for Celsius, and it's quite nice.
Yep, we're still 84 down here. We're still looking at about 30 centigrade or thereabouts, maybe 29.
All right.
So this sponsored piece is called Glenfarclas the Survivor. And as any good sponsored piece does, it speaks very highly of the business acumen that goes on at Glenfarclas. That's not controversial. There's nothing in the article that is controversial. I will say this. They make reference to Glenfarclas 105 launching in 1968. And while I've been very familiar with 105 since about the 90s, the thought that had a birth in 1968 is quite remarkable. What a product to put out into the world.
Especially given that, very few brands were even passing themselves off, even telling the world that they were a quote-unquote pure malt at the time. Or that's really interesting. I don't know how I missed that piece. 1968. Amazing.
Indeed, yeah. Well, if you remember a few years ago, Glenfarclas had put out the 40-year-old 105 as well as the 20-year-old 105.
Yes, I do.
And then there was the ongoing standard non-age statement 105 as well. And to be able to put out a 105 at 40 years old, 60% alcohol after 40 years of maturation is absolutely astounding, especially to the fact that it had texture and flavor. The way you would get away with 60% ABV after 40 years maturation is you would fill at a much, much higher level. But when you fill at that much, much higher level, you're not getting as much interaction with the wood. You're not going to get the same texture. You're not going to get the same flavor.
Yeah.
And so the fact that a 40-year 105 could still be remarkably successful speaks to the acumen at Glenfarclas, something worth celebrating, as we do early and often.
Yeah. I mean, without naming a name, there is a distillery that started relaunching single casks throughout the world. And many of those single casks were of a much higher ABV, mid-ish 60s and even at 13, 15, 17 years of age. And I would argue that whiskey wasn't that great. Like it almost seemed as if maybe you shouldn't have filled the cask so high. But I agree with you. I've had the 20-year-old 105. I've had the 40-year-old 105, and both just really, they sing. The texture is there. The classic style is there. Yeah. So this being a bit of a puff piece or no, it doesn't take away from the fact that Glenfarclas have known how to, and continue to make remarkably great whiskey. Yeah.
Yeah. I think of another point that they were bringing up in the sponsored piece was talking about this ability of distilleries to zig when the industry zags. And so there was this talk about Glenfarclas were supplying blenders who were making products into brands that were selling globally. And Glenfarclas thought, maybe we should get some of that action, right? And hot on the heels of us covering Gordon MacPhail, saying, look, instead of jumping through hoops to keep renewing these new make contracts, they're getting harder and harder to secure as brands are looking farther and farther afield to sell. We'll just focus on our own 2 distilleries.
Yeah.
And when a distillery like Glenfarclas, or, and you and I were discussing this before we hit the record button, or someone like a Springbank, right? Independent distilleries who understand how to last long in this game, right? Yeah. Who don't respond to the latest trends. I'm pausing myself here because I'm being careful with my language, and so I think it's a good time to stop and have a chat about it.
Okay.
We've known this, right? The Glenfarclas don't dance to the vagaries of the market. Springbank don't dance to the vagaries of the market. However, they very successfully sell. And one could argue Glenfarclas have done a terrific job out in Asia. And Springbank, without naming any particular market, were reading these news stories, right? I don't know if we covered one on Extra last year, but you see the theft of Springbank that's headed to market. Yeah. I'm thinking of the story where the perfect square was cut out the canopy of the truck that was carting other single malt scotches along with the Springbank, and the Springbank was just perfectly square. We'll be having that. Thank you very much, and off we jolly well go. So is it safe to say they don't respond to the vagaries of the marketplace? We know that Springbank did increase their output. They have turned on the taps a little more. Now, they're not producing an insane amount that would be as much as some other very well-known brands, but they've increased their output. Do you think, Joshua Hatton, as you and I sit here discussing it this day, do you think it's fair that we continually say Glenfarclas and Springbank don't respond to the vagaries of the marketplace?
I do. Yeah. Oh no. Listen. I most definitely do. And I would just start at the base, the foundation. When I say start at the base or the foundation, I mean simply from the perspective of how they approach the market. When's the last time Glenfarclas has done a package redesign? Their packaging looks the same as it did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Now, Springbank, on the other hand, have updated their packaging maybe within the past 5 years or so, but I would argue it got updated to an even more antiquated look. It's not, compare that to, say, the more recent Glenmorangie repackaging, where they've like took the Glenmorangie name and like separated it across 4 different levels, and like, does it look like a Scotch whiskey presentation? It doesn't, right? It's just doing something different, and they're trying to lead the market with what they're doing. And these guys are saying, nah, what we've been doing is just fine. And if you start from that base of this is how we present ourselves, I mean, you can't really say same old recipe, new design. It's same old recipe, pretty much the similar design. They just continue to do what they have been doing, and you hear these stories, Ranald from Springbank and Mark Watt when he was with them back in the day, and what they said was, Mr. Wright would continue to do what Springbank was doing, regardless of what the market dictated, because that's what they've done. And they remain incredibly successful doing that.
It is interesting when you bring it down to 2 key patriarchs, right? You've got John Grant at Glenfarclas, you've got Headley Wright representing the Mitchell family with Springbank and associated distilleries. Can you think of other examples where there's specifically within Scottish distillation? Can you think of other examples where there are strong patriarchs like that who say, look, our family before us stayed the course, we will stay the course. We're not going to respond to these global demands. We're not going to go into a new... it's interesting. As much as Glenfarclas is quite large when you're on site, and they have what... And again, you're not going to do this only from memory, but 6 stills happening at Glenfarclas. When were we last inside Glenfarclas looking at stills?
I want to say 4. Okay, right. Anyway, continue. Yes, a number of stills between 4 and 6. Right. Yes.
Right. And then you've got washbacks that haven't really increased. Stainless steel at Glenfarclas, wood at Springbank. Like they haven't gone into this. We could build a much larger distillery next door. If you're Glenfarclas, maybe Springbank are curtailed by the space of Campbelltown. I feel like if Springbank wanted to find space in Campbelltown, they could find space in Campbelltown. But there's this hesitance to say, look, we're just going to double our facility and we're going to respond to these global demands. Can you think of another example that fits that? Either with a patriarch or even corporate?
Yeah, it's tough. I can think of distilleries that have a strong, like Kilchoman comes to mind, right? Where Anthony may not be saying, look, we do, and we're going to continue doing what we do. We don't care what you say. I would argue to a point he's doing that, but he's doubled his still house. He's going to double the doubling of that. So he's looking to meet demand. I would argue, however, they started off with tiny productions. They started off doing, 20,000 liters of spirit per year in the first couple of years or whatever. And now they're going to get up to 1.2 million. I would argue what they're growing to is the size of a properly small distillery. And, so yeah, I mean, William Grant and Sons, that's still privately owned. That is a family run business. Now, granted, it takes, on the face of it, it's quite different. So they're not, they're fiercely independent, but they're not doing what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that makes the point. And I think that shows some of the decisions that are being made by a Glenfarclas and a Springbank, right? Yeah. You could be adding on, you could be making more to sell more, and yet you're not. On one hand, I'm asking myself the question on the fly, why do we value that? So I'll ask the question of you while I continue to think about it in my own head. Why do we value that, Joshua?
Because it's a thing, right?
It is a thing. There's no denying that.
Like there's something to be said about, these guys still do it the old way, right? It's right. Again, back, yeah. I'll go back to Kilchoman. It's why Kilchoman talk about, their story is we're producing whiskey in a way that on Islay that really hasn't been done in 124 years, right? We're a farm distillery. We're doing something the old way. And there's something so romantic about that and so nice about that. That it proves that they were doing it so good back then. There's no turd to be polishing here, right? They don't need to do anything else. It doesn't detract from those that do make adjustments or from those that do redesign their liquid. And there's plenty of examples of things like that. It's just, that's their story and they're sticking to it. And it's kind of special. The last thing that I'll say about this is, and this one may be a bit of a stretch, but back when Pappy Van Winkle was getting popular, and I would put that at around 2013 to 2015, somewhere around that range. Mm-hmm. Those were the days when you couldn't simply go to your store and grab the bottle you wanted and leave the other bottles for other people to get. Part of the reason that people were so attracted to the Pappy bottles was not because it was Pappy, was because that liquid was sourced from Stitzel Weller, this distillery that made a very specific style. And people are like, man, they used to do it this way. It's that old Stitzel juice. And boy, it's so good. And, this, that, and the other thing. And now granted, the Buffalo Trace liquid is delicious and it's great whiskey and so on and so forth. But when you talk about the Stitzel Weller juice, it's different, right? And that's why when you talk about, these guys haven't changed anything, that's different. That's cool, right? So, yeah, there's that callback to things that are, for the most part, a yesteryear thing. But here's a modern example where they're still doing that yesteryear.
Well, and it's that's kind of the point I was kind of slowly bringing us to, as our banner suggests, modern spirits business. When you're the Glenfarclas, you're the Springbank, there's a way in which you putting out your malt is king, absolute king. And while there is some Glenfarclas and differently named Glenfarclas sometimes appearing in independent bottlings, look, that's our independent bottling company right there above the
sometimes
Glenfarclas name.
Yet rare as hen teeth. Go on.
Oh, look, that's what's in Jason's glass right now. So here we've got the lead on from the Gordon MacPhail piece, right? Is right now you cannot get liquid out of Springbank. You really cannot get liquid out of Glenfarclas. You've now got Gordon and MacPhail moving away from some new make contracts where they were with Glen Grant, and they put out some excellent Glen Grant and Glen Talkers, and I think they had some Linkwood in the original, the distillery labels as well. Right? We're back again to this conversation of, it's wonderful to be able to show off a distillery in a different package, with a different philosophy, from a different company.
Yeah.
And yet, in these periods of boom, when some distilleries are increasing capacity, increasing production in making nothing available, you've got old stalwarts like Glenfarclas and Springbank not really increasing capacity and certainly not making things available. I have a frustration as both a consumer and an independent bottling company owner that there should still be allowance here. There should still be allotment that can go out the door to other people, to show another side, to do something else.
Yeah.
And I wonder, we're obviously going to see it come back. We're seeing it going away at the moment. We know this industry is cyclical. We know, again, to reuse a joke from earlier in the episode, that there are more peaks and troughs than a Toblerone. Is it unfair? David Stirk right now is waggling his finger either at his ham radio or his PC sitting on his desk in his office, that we don't get to talk about unfair, right? Can I just for 1 second throw my toys out the pram and say, this is unfair? Like, I want to be able to buy whiskey.
Yes, it's horribly unfair.
Is it unfair?
Listen, we established in 2011, and it was in 2010 that Springbank stopped selling to independents, right? That's not fair. They should have waited. Didn't they know?
We have carried that with us for 12 years.
But listen, I don't think I lift that bottle one last time. Go ahead. Boop. This is where you can't cry unfair. Who else is doing a Glenfarclas in their own livery on their label with the Glenfarclas logo, right? That's true. What do they call it? Spirit of collaboration, right? That really is something that was quite special and remains quite special. And who knows what the future holds? We'll leave it at that. Yeah, listen, from an independent bottler standpoint, yes, it seems incredibly unfair. And I would argue that it felt unfair in the previous trough or peak or what have you, right? To those
trough
existing
for us, peak for them.
bottlers. And it be what it be. But that's been the nature. We just happen to be experiencing all of the seasons, right? It's really for as bad as it is right now for independent bottlers gaining access to single malt whiskey from Scotland. There was a time when there was so much available to us that it allowed us to create a retail range of bottlings, right? So
yeah, right.
So I say take back some of your toys. Don't throw them all out. Just a couple here and there.
Just rip one head off one soft toy. That's all I'm allowed.
Just the one.
But to something that you and I were talking about this morning, actually, in our regular meeting, is we started this company 10 years ago, and that was 2011 and 12 years. Sorry, sorry. Yeah, I was thinking decade. 12 years. You're absolutely right. And here we were in 2011, lining up bottlings for 2012 and bringing them into the country. And then, and this is why I was using the numbers that I was. And then there we were 5 years later with access to enough casks that we were able to go about launching that retail line.
Mm-hmm.
But and then 2019 we launched global retail on top of that. And I would say for the last 2, perhaps 3 years, that it feels like every passing week it looks remarkably different. What's there, what's available. And it just, here's the part that I keep returning to.
Okay. You're still throwing your toys out the pram?
No, this is me very slowly turning the head on a stuffed toy before I rip it off its shoulders.
Okay, just making sure.
We present spirit of collaboration. And as a good independent bottler, and I say that because there are other good independent bottlers as well. Mm-hmm. As a good independent bottler, we put a distillery name front and center, and we champion that distillery, and we're proud to champion that distillery. I just feel that the spirit of collaboration gets called into question when one party then says, we're actually having such a good time and such a successful time that we don't actually have anything to sell you right now.
Yeah. Wow, you really are. You're showing people your wounds here. What do they call that? I can't think of the word. Yeah, listen, you're right. Again, we're living in a really interesting time where everybody's heard this. Anybody who's this deep into whiskey, who's deep into the independently bottled whiskey side of the business, they all know the stories, right? They all know that when the whiskey industry is booming and the brands were taking off, that those brands, those distilleries pulled back from selling to the independent bottlers. They know the stories that when the industry was just falling out from under itself, that the distilleries said, "Wait a second, guys, we actually do have stuff for you, right? This is what Mark Watt talked about for years, right? We're the best friend in times of bust, and we're the thorn in the side in times of boom."
Yep.
The difference now is that there is podcasting and there is nonstop talking heads. People are living through it now. And so it just, we're able to kvetch in real time is really what's happening. There's no I wouldn't say there's no difference, right? I think some of the circumstances surrounding what has made liquid unavailable has changed a little bit. Like you had said, distilleries are really ramping up, minus Springbank and Glenfarclas, like we talked about. They're not really ramping up so much, but others are, in hopes that India opens up, in hopes that parts of China open up. And if that doesn't happen, well, maybe it is the same, right? If that doesn't happen, then there's going to be this whiskey loch that's thrown upon us. But the difference being, though, with that potential whiskey loch and the one that we talk about, in the 80s, is the demand for whiskey remains. And that's what was lost in the 80s. The demand was away. People were going to vodka and gin or different distilled spirits, period. The demand remains. And that is in part because Scotch whiskey has helped the growth of bourbon, has helped the growth of world single malts. Add to that the number of markets that have opened since the resurgence of whiskey starting in the early aughts of this millennium. So there are some differences, but not many, I guess. Did I make a point? I think I made a point.
I think you did.
Good. Whew.
For me, I'm kind of distilling it down to a kind of a central point here, and I think this is where I hopefully find the listeners of a whiskey podcast, in this instance, extra, as was a whiskey podcast that is obviously One Nation Under Whiskey, which is there are so many times when I realize that I am a whiskey lover first and a whiskey businessman second.
Yes.
And I think sometimes I feel the need to throw my toys out the pram, because the response to whatever's happening in the modern spirits business is it's just a business. It's just business. It's just how business works.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of the consumers who love whiskey and love distilleries and love independent bottlers.
Yeah.
And I don't think they think of it as a business. I think they think of it as a passion, right? And wouldn't it be incredible to see Laphroaig coming from 6 different places, right? 5 independent bottlers and a distillery, right? Like that to me speaks to the attraction and the value of the passion that we all share. And so when we as independent bottlers come at it with passion and are passionate about the distilleries that we represent, and we want to show them off to the very best of their abilities, and then find out that, hey, for the last decade, tickety-boo, things are changing. Don't say never, but who knows what the future holds, right? Thinking about, a Gordon MacPhail, right? I mean, other stories from other independent bottlers that we're friendly with, right? Like you hear this all the time. Like, it's not going to work for this year. Let's try again next year. It's not going to work for the next 3 years. Let's try again at the end of that, right?
Yeah.
Is independent bottling a business?
I think there's a spectrum.
And everyone's on it.
I think one of the yes, everyone's on it, right? I mean, I think on one end of the spectrum, because it is fairly easy to get into independent bottling if you wanted to. I mean, technically speaking, you don't need to hold too many licenses or anything like that. You can rely on third-party bottling halls. You can rely on the warehouse's own licenses and so on. It's a matter of having the money for a cask and having customers who will pay for it, and hopefully you've lined up your distribution channel in a way that's legal, and you can make shit happen, right? And there's plenty of people who are there where they're doing it as a hobby.
Very much so.
And yet they're calling themselves independent bottlers. Those are the terms that they use, because the system that they're talking about is independent bottling. Whether they are independent bottlers is another thing. What they're doing is bottling independently. The other end of the spectrum is your Cadenheads, is your Gordon MacPhails, is your Adelphis, right? Is your Single Malts of Scotland, where these are brand signatory, right? They're big brands that have significant amount of stock, so much so that they are able to weather the peaks and troughs of your Toblerone candy. And therefore, yes, it 100% is a business. Scotch Malt Whiskey Society. There's another one, 40 years now, 1983, right? So these are businesses, right? And then in between, you've got a plethora. And we are somewhere in that plethora. We're definitely not hobbyists, but we're definitely not your Gordon MacPhails of the world. And I don't know if we're Goldilocks either, but we're somewhere in there.
Yeah, we're definitely not Gordon MacPhail with a little cheeky little £15,000 Port Ellen up our sleeves. That's why I keep
Oh,
wearing
right.
short sleeves.
That's
I
right
got
there.
nothing up here. Yeah, I got nothing up these sleeves. And that's, I really, when I do have a little strop, when I do throw my toys out the pram, I do stop to ask myself, why are you throwing your toys out your pram? And sometimes I feel like it's because I get my heart broken, right? I love too much, Joshua. I love too easily. I fall in love too fast.
Yeah,
Me
listen,
and Chet Baker.
it I I think it's part of the reason that so many distilleries have chosen to work with us directly. It's because it goes beyond us being whiskey lovers, and it's in the realm of us saying, we want to champion you. This is coming from a place of passion, right? And so you can understand why in these more difficult times, it's going to feel incredibly personal, because at the end of the day, and I talk about this quite often in tastings, because right, whiskey is so romantic, and it's like, oh, the magic. And
Right,
as soon as you
right,
mention
right.
spreadsheets, or as soon as you mention, hey, at the end of the day, this is a manufacturing facility that makes an end product that is really keen on establishing vertical integration to cut down costs. And like, you're like, wait a second, we're not talking about building, you know, cabinetry or industrial storage products. No, you're talking about a product made at an industrial facility where people have to wear safety equipment. Like, it's a thing. What makes it magical is the importance that we put on it. Is what makes it magical is the are the memories that just the smell of a Springbank or a Lagavulin or Kilchoman can evoke, and you're transported, right? Speaking of which, really quickly, I couldn't find my bottle of SCN Glenfarclas. So what I've done, and I think about this every August or so,
Mm-hmm.
is I got
Mm-hmm.
this 105, and I bought this after your dad had passed. And I think about this every year around this time of year,
Cheers.
and with Glenfarclas sort of being the foundation of this conversation, I thought, and given the time of year, I thought, why not give this a pour? So to your
Cheers.
dad.
Thanks ever so much. Yeah, there's to my dad. July 31
July
was
31, that's
the
right.
6th anniversary of his passing, and I think it's actually the day we recorded the Gordon MacPhail piece.
That's true. That's exactly what it was. And I always associate it with early August, and maybe that's just because it was very end of July. So
Right. Yeah. The dates I was missing. His funeral was early August as well. So
maybe that's the
and I
connection.
was in Scotland, and you were covering a lot of things for me in early August. So
Yeah. There you go. That all checks out.
All right. Well, here, listen. It just feels better to say some of the quiet things out loud. And I know that we have listeners who nod along as we say the quiet parts out loud. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate having ears on what we say, what we think, what we do, what we believe in, what we value, and what we champion. So, as much as you're toasting to my dad, I'm toasting along with you, Joshua, to our listeners, our supporters, our nation, even that nation globally, because we have Single Cask Nation people in myriad countries. So cheers to all of them.
Cheers, indeed. Even down there, we even have members
Even down there. If you see a breaking news story in the dog days of summer, you can drop us a note, info@singlecasknation.com, or questions at One Nation Under Whiskey. I will say, again, quiet part out loud, I've temporarily lost access to questions at One Nation Under Whiskey. So if you send it to info@singlecasknation.com, I will definitely get my eyes on it. And I promise you, I will even save it as a PDF and then put it in the folder on my desktop for later sharing.
I can't believe you found me out. I finally successfully blocked you from questions at One Nation Under Whiskey.
Kudos, my friend. You've pulled it off, but I still have a direct contact to our listeners. So info@singlecastnation.com if you want Jason's eyes on anything. Other than that, Joshua, thank you for your time today. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks to the Spirits Business for having a sponsored piece on Glenfarclas that provided the jumping off point for us. And my storm has passed. As you can see, literally and figuratively, it is much brighter now. Things are looking awfully good. Joshua has closing words.
Well, I guess my question to you is, when you present a bottle to someone, what do we normally tell them? Because safety first, right?
Hashtag please drink the whole bottle responsibly. Hey! And we also say smash that subscribe button responsibly as well. And Joshua, what do the young people say?
The young people say, tickle that bell. I think that's what they say.
If I'd known he was going to say that, I would have opened the door.
The thing you say, tickle that bell.
Do you start at the base of the bell and work your way from there?
Whatever makes it ding. However you can get there. Yeah, apparently. So for those of you that are more familiar with YouTube than we are, well, I'm not very familiar with it, or maybe you're not familiar and this is good information for you. Subscribing to us is one thing. Firstly, please do it. If you've already done it, thank you so much. If you haven't done it, thank you in advance for doing it. We really appreciate it. Secondly, there's a little bell next to the videos or next to our name or whatever. And if you click that bell, if you tickle that bell, as they say, you will get notifications when there's a new episode coming, or sometime Jason and I have talked about doing some live YouTube things here and there. We've yet to do it, but we've talked about it a whole hell of a lot. So subscribe, tickle that bell, and that's going to be a name of a new song, by the way, Tickle That Bell. And you'll get notified of the content that you've then subscribed to. So thank you in advance for doing that.
And until next time, peace.